Okay, that is a cello sonata that was written in the later part of the 19th century by someone named Rita Stahl, and it is entitled Titus and Berenice. Now, there's really very little written about Berenice, and yet somehow she has come down in history and literature. And there were two plays written about her, one by Racine and one by Corneille. There are operas written about her, one by Haydn, one by Handel. There are zillions of novels written about her, one even by Howard Fast. And yet, who is she? She was not one of our heroic women. She wasn't Ruth or Esther or Judith or Golda Meir. She was one of our scandalous queens. Today, we're going back to the Roman Empire, just about the time the Julio-Claudian Empire self-destructed and was succeeded by the year of 4 emperors and the advent of the Flavians. And so even though all of these things are based practically on about, I would say, about 200 words about Berenice, mostly from Josephus, and I'm going to rely on him for the facts as they may be. I mean, he did have a certain point of view because he was a participant in all of this. And his books are The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews. And there's a little soupçon of Suetonius and Tacitus, but mostly Josephus is my source. He was an administrator and a general. He was the governor of Galilee. He fought against the Romans and switched sides when it was inevitable. By the way, the book is a great read if you're careful to get the translation by G.A. Williamson. I started another one and had to give up on it. Josephus' account, written in the third person of the rivalry between the two master schemers, himself and governor of Galilee, and a maverick revolutionary named John, is really, really funny. You should read it. The action takes place both in Rome and the sliver of land that we know today as Israel. At the beginning of the 1st century of the Common Era, there was no country of Israel, but instead a cluster of little states, the most important being Judea, Samaria, Galilee, and Idumea. The province of Judea, a part of the Roman Empire, included Judea, of course, together with Idumea and Samaria. Other regions got lumped in from time to time, but these were the most important. These states definitely did not get along. In 597 or so BCE, the Jews of Judea were taken by Nebuchadnezzar after his destruction of the first temple and held captive in Babylon. They were sent back home by Cyrus the Great in 538 or so to build a new temple in Jerusalem. About 150 years before that, Shalmaneser of Assyria had invaded Samaria, taken Jewish captives, and replaced them with colonizers of his own who claimed to be Jews. But the Jews of Judea refused to accept them as such. The bad blood between the two was shed from time to time, right down to the period we'll be talking about. The split between the Edomites and the Judeans goes back to Esau and Jacob. Jacob being the good guy and Esau the one who sold his birthright for soup. The Edomites made graven images and circumcised in a different style. So if I can get back to my slideshow here. There's the map of all the parts. There's Idumea, there's Judea, there's Galilee, and so forth. And this is one of the graven images of the Idumeans, and I will not show the image of the way they circumcised, sorry. Okay. There was a big schism between the Aramaic-speaking Jews and Gentiles whose families had arrived during the Seleucid period, when the area was ruled by the successors of Alexander the Great, who spoke Greek. The two groups pretty much hated one another. A sect also arose in the early 1st century of the Common Era, originating in Galilee, that caused some unrest after all. If that weren't enough, there were three large sects of Jews, the Essenes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, who didn't get along at all that well with each other. The Pharisees were the poorest and mostly involved with Torah, the Jewish law, rather than the temple. Matthew, who was a gentle, kindly sort for an apostle, goes off on a ballistic rant about how awful and hypocritical the Pharisees were. The Essenes were themselves split, with some, like the American Shakers, believing in celibacy and refusing marriage, and others disagreeing. The most devout Essenes lived in communes, taking their meals communally and working together. They held property communally, very much like the early Zionists millennia later. They were the originators of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I show here. The Sadducees, which were predominantly from the upper classes, were the most Romanized and also most involved with the temple and the priesthood. When Josephus finished the Judean equivalent of high school, he studied with each of the three groups in turn, ending up as a Pharisee. Around 167 BCE, there was a major revolt by the family of the Maccabees against King Antiochus of the Seleucids, which the Maccabees won, establishing the Jewish Hasmonean dynasty. In celebration of their victory, God made the lights in the temple to burn for 8 days as required of law, although there wasn't enough oil. And that's why we celebrate Hanukkah by lighting lights and eating potato pancakes, which are oily. Conflicts within the dynasty resulted in a civil war in which the Romans intervened in the person of General Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey for short. Once in the area, he took it over. In 63 BCE, and Judea entered the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was having its own troubles and civil wars, a state that persisted through the 1st century BC and into that of the Common Era. Rival factions continued to struggle with one another in Judea after both Pompey and Caesar were dead. And now another slide. Mark Antony, who contended with Caesar's adopted heir, Octavius, for domination in Rome, supported Herod, later the Great, in his bid to take over Judea. Herod was the son of an Edomite father and an Arab mother who had converted to Judaism. After 2 sieges of Jerusalem and 10 years of campaigning backed by Roman legions, the Romans proclaimed him king of the Jews. So you see, he kind of owed them. Herod then exterminated all potential rivals, including most of the Hasmonean family, as well as one of his own wives. He probably didn't miss her because he had 9 others. He is the Herod, according to the New Testament, who ordered the massacre of the innocents if it happened, since there's controversy. And it was his son who had John the Baptist beheaded. It was all over in 27 BCE when Octavius defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium, and Cleopatra suicided by serpent. Octavius became the first Roman emperor, and Cleopatra will arise as ghost later in Berenice's story. One last word on Herod the Great. It is said or Herod bragged, that Cleopatra tried to seduce him and failed. Another source says Herod's mother-in-law begged Cleopatra to get Antony to kill Herod because she blamed Herod for her brother's death by drowning. I somehow doubt this. The drowning was supposedly accidental, and if Cleopatra wanted to have Herod dead, it was probably from pique at being spurned or him saying so. Anyway, Antony let him live. The Herodian dynasty, loyal client state of Rome, was underway. Almost every male in the Herodian family tree was named Herod, but the two that are important for us had the Roman name Agrippa added at birth to show where their loyalties belonged. Berenice was Herod the Great's great-great-granddaughter. Her father, Herod the Great's grandson, was variously referred to as Herod Agrippa, Marcus Julius Agrippa, Herod II, Herod I, and Agrippa I. I will call him Herod I, even though he obviously wasn't the first king named Herod, and his son, Berenice's brother, I will call Herod II. Born to the royal family, you would think that Berenice's life, and there we are, the one with the red arrows are the ones I was just talking about, or should be, and the yellow arrow is for Berenice's husband, one of them, third. Born to the royal family, you would think that Berenice's life would have at least started in security and luxury, but that was not the case. Herod I, Berenice's father, was determined to be king of Judea, and to get there, it was necessary to get cozy with the Roman emperor, who in Herod I's time was first Tiberius and then Caligula. And those of you who might remember my last talk will recall that Tiberius was profligate and Caligula played hard, just about bankrupting the Roman Empire, and his courtiers were expected to play along at their expense. Herod was born in 11 BC and spent his childhood and early youth in Rome and Capri at the court of Tiberius, where he was friends with Tiberius's son Drusus. When Drusus died, probably poisoned by the Dowager Empress Livia, who wanted her side of the family to succeed Tiberius, Herod I thought it prudent, as a near associate of the deceased, to return as quickly as possible to Judea with his wife Cypros and little Berenice, then less than 3 years old. In 23, they settled, not getting as far as they wanted to, in Malatha, a village in the Negev in Idumea. It's now in ruins, but given the pictures of it, I could see getting seriously bored in such a place. And where do we go? Yes, here we are. Apparently, Herod I agreed with me. Tiberius fixed him up with a job as supervisor of the markets, and it depressed him so much he thought about suicide, at least according to Josephus. He fled to Antioch in the province of Syria, where a friend, Pomponius Flaccus, took him in, and Berenice as well, of course. Flaccus was governor of Syria. Herod, ever improvident, took a bribe from some Damascenes to get them a good result in a judicial proceeding before Flaccus, who found out about it and told Herod to get lost. Herod wanted desperately to get back to Rome, but his way wasn't clear. He got as far as the point of Caesarea and was jailed there because of mega unpaid debts. He escaped at night and got to Alexandria in Egypt sometime between 32 and 35 CE. There, the Alabarch, which is the governor, Tiberius Marcus Alexander, and as Zach said, a lot of the names of the Jews were Alexander, lent Cypros, but not Herod, because Cypros had the better experience score, 200,000 drachmas, about $100,000, to refinance Herod's debts and buy a ticket to Rome, while Cyprus went back to Judea and little Berenice got engaged. There's much to speculate about here. Herod was present in Rome when Caligula was killed in 41 CE, and Josephus implies that he and his brother, later Herod of Chalcis, and Berenice's third spouse, were instrumental in putting Claudius on the throne. And yes, here is a Judean coin bearing testimony to this particular thing, or so I am told. Of course, that contradicts the charming story that Claudius was fortuitously found cowering in a closet or under some furniture and dragged out to be the emperor. Claudius was Alexander's paternal uncle by marriage, so the plot does kind of thicken. Also in 41, Berenice, aged 13, was wedded to Tiberius, Alexander's son, or a younger brother. Sources differ. Marcus Julius Alexander. Did Tiberius Alexander, the oligarch of Alexandria and leader of the Jewish population there, recognize Herod's potential despite his unpromising start in adult life? Alexander's family was fabulously wealthy. Did he foresee a role for himself as kingmaker of the next emperor? Was Berenice basically sold? In any case, it worked out well, at least financially for her. She became an extremely wealthy but childless widow at the tender age of 16 when Marcus Julius died in 44 at the age of 28, and she was immediately married off to her uncle Herod, a yet different Herod, now king of Chalcis. Such a marriage is permitted under Jewish law. She bore him two sons, Hyrcanus and Berenice. In addition to being king of Chalcis, this Herod was later entrusted with the administration of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, even appointing the high priest. This is a big deal. Berenice kept the title of Queen of Chalcis after her husband's death in 48, and his will left her twice as wealthy as she'd been before. In case you're wondering where Chalcis is, it's actually in Turkey, and they call it Cilicia in tourist speak. Here, I think, is the map. And somewhere around here. Yes, there it is. And here's some Roman graffiti from the area. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Herod I's complex career was not over. He made it back to Rome and scouted around for a patron, finally settling on one, Caius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, who was nicknamed after the cute military boots he'd worn during his childhood amongst the military, Caligula. Caligula invited Herod I to dinner, and ever the sycophant, Herod said out loud he couldn't wait for Tiberius to die, and Caligula could be the emperor. Unfortunately for him, the remark got back to Tiberius, the emperor, and Herod got popped into prison. Fortunately for him, Tiberius died a couple of years later, and Caligula let him out. This is the man from whom Berenice learned the lessons of life and survival. After Herod of Chalcis' death, Chalcis was given by Claudius to King Herod II of Judea, and along with it came Berenice. She governed alongside the king, participating fully in the functions of government, even to sitting with great pomp in judgment along with Herod II at the preliminary hearing of the Apostle Paul. at Caesarea in 59 CE. Paul had been born in Tarsus, Chalcis, and raised as a Pharisee, but he was a Roman citizen. The Roman procurator agreed with Herod II and Berenice that Paul had done nothing wrong and urged him to go to Jerusalem for trial. But the apostle had made the mistake of appealing to the emperor, Nero, and by law, he had to be sent to Rome instead. It did not go well. Berenice's return to the bosom of her family was not entirely peaceful. There is an odd report that, beautiful as she was, her sister Drusilla, the younger by 10 years, was significantly prettier. Berenice, who had 10 years of ruling the Rus, was reportedly jealous and made her sister's life as miserable as possible. There had always been a faction in Judea that longed for the end of Roman domination and hated the Roman appointed governor. One of the other rumors that swirled around Berenice's family life, probably originating from this group, was that she was in an incestuous relationship with her brother, Herod II. It was made easier to believe because Caligula had bragged openly about sleeping with all three of his sisters. Whether to quiet the rumors or because Berenice was nostalgic for the wedded state, she married this guy, Polemon II of Pontus in 48, thus making him king of Cilicia. The couple most likely resided in Cilicia, since Pontus is way north in Anatolia, actually bordering on the Black Sea. Berenice had made it a condition of the marriage that Polemon convert to Judaism and undergo circumcision, which he did. Even so, the marriage broke up after 2 years, and Berenice returned to the Herod palace and her brother in Jerusalem. Pontus, who seems to have been a bit of a seeker, gave up on Judaism, not surprisingly, and became a Christian, only to abandon that for Roman paganism sometime later. This is a coin of him with his picture. After the first Seder in 44, Herod I became seriously ill with some kind of stomach problem. He recovered enough to attend the gladiator games a little later, but died shortly after that. The Greek population rioted in sheer joy. Among other outrages, they put the statues Herod I had made against Jewish law of his 3 daughters, including Berenice, up on the roof of a well-known brothel, and publicly assaulted them with every kind of sexual insult and innuendo. Herod II complained to Claudius, who promised to exile the Roman soldiers who had joined in that merriment, but never did so. Herod II was only 16 when his father died, and Claudius had been persuaded that he was too young to reign. So for the first time, a procurator was sent from Rome. Although Herod II, king of Jerusalem, and Berenice, queen of Chalcis, retained their titles and some administrative functions of the government, the procurator and any other officers of the empire, Roman legions present on the site, had ultimate power. And this is when the troubles started. As we know, the emperors of Rome had pretty much of a straight line graph of increasing awfulness after Augustus, with a little plateau marking the reign of Claudius. According to Tacitus, Tiberius had kicked the Jews out of Rome, but he says, that's Tacitus said, that was because of disturbances stirred up by one man he called Crassus. And so I think this was probably the Christians who were the target of the exile. Although I don't know if the Romans quibbled that much over the distinction. Mostly the Romans were tolerant to the various religions at this period, as long as they paid taxes and didn't make trouble. But all that was during the early part of the reign of Nero. He had just eliminated his mother, Agrippina the Younger, and was enjoying his new freedom from mom's negative. Let's see what happens. Yes, mom's negative comments about his love life. But Rome was involved in two hot wars, one against the Parthians, over which the two empires would rule Armenia, and the other a serious eruption in Britain, led by the outraged and surprisingly effective Boudica. And let me see if I can get back to the Parthians. Well, they don't really need it. Parthia was an enormous empire at the time. Well, what are provinces and client states for? Time to pay back all the benefits of being in the Roman Empire. Taxes went up a lot. The various officers of the empire, including the proculatorships, were auctioned off to the highest bidder, who, backed by Roman legions, intended to recoup his investment at whatever cost to the governed province. Predictable protests erupted amongst the Jews, particularly in the sect founded way back when Judea joined the Roman Empire, called the Zealots. They objected to the Roman occupation and allied themselves with another sect called the Sicarii, who not only objected to the Romans, but raided the homes and occasionally assassinated those they considered to be collaborators. They carried daggers under their clothes for this purpose at all times, and their name means dagger in Latin. Not all Judeans rallied to the cause of freedom. To begin with, there were all those tensions pulling the population apart. Roman domination had meant a suppression of internal conflict and shelter from foreign investments. The first outright rebellion was during Caligula's short rule. He had deified himself without waiting for the Senate to vote him that honor after his death, when they denied it to him, and demanded that statues of himself as a god be erected in the temple, a desecration of Judea's holiest site by this gross violation of Jewish law. I digress for a second to say more than a second, that not all Romans were bad guys. In response to the Judean protest, Caligula ordered the legate of Syria, that's the one in charge of the legions, Petronius, his full name isn't recorded, to march his legions to Jerusalem and put up the damn statues. His instructions were to kill anyone resisting and enslave the rest of the population. Well, yes, there was resistance. The whole population of Jerusalem met the Romans on the plain near the city and begged for their ancient laws and their own lives. Petronius tried to explain the whole rest of the empire was cool with statues. Their particular refusal would be seen in Rome as rebellion and treason. He let them know what Caligula had instructed him to do. They were unmoved and swore that they would rather die alone with their wives and children than break the law. Petronius was moved. He knew that unless the impasse was resolved, the population would die of famine because the sieging time was nearly over. He told them he would plead to the emperor for them and offer his life if that was necessary. And he meant it. He returned to Antioch and sent a dispatch to the emperor. The reply was a death sentence for him, only it arrived too late. Caligula had been assassinated. The world is not full of Petroniuses. The provocations got worse under Nero. More young Jews began to join the Zealots. Others became Sicarii. The last procurator before the Jewish war, as Josephus calls it, was Gessius Florus. He was so bad that Josephus accuses him of deliberate provocation so that the Jews would be blamed for the resultant unrest and not his own incompetence. And let's go ahead. This, by the way, is Josephus at the time. On more than one occasion, hundreds, even thousands of Jews were killed or trampled when Flores turned the cavalry on peaceful protesters, which he did for any sign of disrespect. One incident alone, according to Josephus, caused the loss of 20 to 30,000 Jewish lives. A cavalry charge caused a stampede of the protesters, who panicked and crushed one another, and the horses trampled on the fallen. This kind of figure used to be dismissed out of hand as exaggerated, but recent studies have validated many such statistics as estimates of ancient populations get revised upwards. The previous procurator had caused outrage by erecting a golden eagle in front of the temple. That was bad enough, but Flores commandeered 17 talents belonging to the temple's treasury and claimed they were owed for back taxes. One talent was worth somewhere over $500,000 current USD. To make matters far, far worse, Flores announced he would put statues of various emperors, presumably the current and deified ones, in the temple. Herod too was in Alexandria, congratulating his ally and former in-law, Tiberius Marcus Alexander, on his promotion to procurator of Egypt. Berenice was in seclusion, not in the Hasmonean palace, the seat of government, but in the Herod palace, their residence, completing the 30 days of ritual preparation for a vow she planned to take. The preparation required shaving her head and walking barefoot. Jerusalem was in full riot mode, with crowds surging down the narrow streets so densely that the Roman cavalry was stopped, unable to charge this wall of human beings. Dreading another massacre, she gathered her bodyguard, walking at their head barefoot to keep the preparation for her vow. She led them to the palace where Flores lived, and there she pleaded for her people. He didn't listen. Instead, he sent his soldiers on the little group, who managed somehow to get her to the Hasmonean palace, where she was temporarily safe. Indeed, Queen Berenice must have been beloved by the people, despite rumors of incest that swirled around her and her brother. When Herod returned from Alexandria and addressed the population in an attempt to quiet the rioting mobs, he placed her on the roof of the Hasmonean palace, so she would be seen by everyone as approving his remarks, which mostly told them to quiet down, as they were deluded, they were, by the way, to think they could take on the Roman Empire, and they'd be very sorry if they tried. They didn't listen, or if they did, they didn't agree. Herod too and Berenice fled from Jerusalem to Galilee, and then to Caesarea Philippi in the Roman province of Syria, which is not Caesarea in Israel, as they were obviously no longer relevant to the government of Judea and were now in grave danger from both the Romans and the Jews. Things got worse. More provocations from Flores, more riots, more deaths, until the final explosion came. In 66, Flores called in Cestius Gallius, the legate of Syria, who marched into Judea with the Roman 12th Legion Fulminata from Syria, augmenting his Syrian troops, expecting a walk in the park. Instead, the horses of his cavalry balked, refusing to charge the masses of humanity packed into the crowded streets around the Temple Mount, while hundreds of Jews kept up a lethal barrage of rocks from the surrounding roofs. They'd probably stashed the rocks up there, knowing what was coming. Here, I think, is an artist's reproduction of what Jerusalem looked like at the time. Unable to take the temple, Cestius withdrew and picked the path pass of Beth Horon as the route of his retreat. The Maccabees had ambushed the Seleucid troops at this pass in 166. The Jews remembered, of course, but Cestius hadn't read his history. The Jews repeated the same ambush and triumphed once again. Not only did they kill 6,000 Roman troops, but they also captured the legion's eagle, a great humiliation for Rome and a guarantee of full metal press Roman retaliation. And over here, you can see the pass. It goes right behind this, and that's probably where they got them. The Battle of Beth Horon, unfortunately, encouraged the Zealots and their supporters. The more realistic and informed of the population understood there was zero chance of Judea standing up to a vengeful Roman invasion. Their generals, mostly Seleucid, weren't Alexander the Great, and their army wasn't the well-oiled killing machine of the first century Roman legions. The split between the parties became violent. Jews died by the thousands in the clashes. Those who could fled. In 67, Nero ordered the experienced general Titus Flavius Vespasianus into Judea with 4 legions. We'll call him Vespasian because everybody does, and especially so as not to mix him up with his son, Titus Caesar Vespasianus, in whom we will be more interested. Each Roman legion had between 5,000 and 6,000 soldiers, not counting auxiliary personnel, so that's at least 20,000 superbly armed and trained fighters, all Roman citizens. Vespasian was to stage the invasion from Syria, and so he first went to Caesarea Philippi to meet with Herod and Berenice. There was a wait while the legions caught up with him, and planning and tactics were discussed. Time passed pleasantly, with banquets in the evening starring Berenice, aged 40 and at the height of her beauty, heading the table with her brother. Vespasian, who had a reputation for avarice, was charmed by the expensive gifts that Berenice showered on him, and Titus was hypnotized by the gift giver. Defense of the cities along Vespasian's march from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem was made impossible by the split between those wanting peace and those who were willing to die for freedom, along with anyone else who happened to be in the area. Since the parties of liberty presumed that the peace party would collaborate with Rome and maybe open the town gates for them, they addressed the problem with proactive massacres. Slaughtering thousands of resident Jews had a side benefit, slashing the number of mouths to feed in case of siege, which would be expected. Wives and children of the slaughtered would-be peacemakers were included in the massacre. Before attacking, Vespasian always gave warning to the cities he invaded and a promise to peaceful takeover if there was no resistance. But the Zealots had exterminated anyone who might have listened to the warning. The ensuing massacres by Roman troops in Jotapata, Tarichea, and other places were as bloody and thorough as any by the so-called barbarians Timur or Baba, who also gave such warnings. Although Vespasian certainly didn't leave pyramids of human skulls to mark the place. Or as a matter of fact, Xenophon, on his march up country, we adore classical civilization as ancestors to ours, but neither the Romans nor the Greeks were better than anyone else in this regard. Vespasian had returned to Caesarea to ready his army for the final march on Jerusalem when he received the news of Nero's death. It was not a natural one. Nero had failed to escape from a rebellion of the Praetorian Guard alongside rebelling Roman legions from Germany and joined by everyone else who had 2 feet, when he took too long to pack his stage equipment. He committed assisted suicide by sword, and Rome then went through some changes. Here's a slide of the next three emperors. The year of Nero's death, 68, is known as the year of four emperors. You get the idea. Their names, just in case you're curious, were Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. As for the fourth, we will reveal that shortly. On the news that Galba, the commander of the Spanish legions, was now emperor, Vespasian dispatched Titus to Rome to pay respects. News doesn't travel fast, and apparently Titus took too long to pack, because when he stopped in Greece, he learned that after 7 months of being emperor, Galba had been murdered by the Praetorian Guard, which put Otho, the head of the German legions, on the throne. Titus is reported to have wavered, maybe for 10 seconds. The reasons given were that, one, showing up to honor the last emperor wasn't an auspicious start with the new one. Though, you can make a couple of changes in the gift card, and that would have taken care of it. And two, his father would be waiting for orders from the new regime. But, he could have brought them back as well as anybody else. On the other hand, Berenice was waiting for him. Tacitus, as well as me, thought that was the reason. Going back turned out to be the fortunate choice. Otho only lasted 3 months, and you wouldn't have wanted to be down on his side in the books. And he was replaced by Vitellius. Vespasian's legions and those of Sicily revolted, not against Vespasian, but wanting their guy in power, if anyone was to be. They wanted this enough so that the soldiers threatened to kill him if he didn't make a try for power. Vespasian yielded to their entreaties. What choice did he have? And determined to march on Rome. First step in this process was an appeal to an old friend, Tiberius Marcus Alexander, the father of Berenice's third husband, the man who had rescued Herod I from debtor's prison and set him on his path to power. He was now governor of both Alexandria and Egypt. Does Vespasian whisper to him that Vespasian's heir, Titus, was devoted to Berenice, and she just might be the next empress? And wouldn't it be cool to have a family connection with the empress? Of course it would. Philip B. Sullivan, in a note on the Flavian accession in the Classical Journal, suggests that Berenice herself may have been Vespasian and Titus's go-between to Alexander, although I don't know what evidence she based this on. Certainly, she would have probably been the only person they could probably trust. Even knowing that Titus was poised to annihilate Jerusalem and Alexander's fellow Jews, Alexander was delighted to be of help. He immediately called on both soldiers and the populace to swear allegiance to Vespasian. Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome, and Alexandria was the key to Egypt, surrounded as she was by a sea on one side and a desert on the other. The only river that gives access from somewhere else is navigable only within Egypt's territory. With the support of Egypt, Vespasian could, if necessary, starve Rome. He remained in Alexandria, Titus with him. He sent the troops from Syria to Italy, who joined 2 Roman legions sent by Alexander. Vitellius took one look at the battlefield and offered to resign, but his soldiers wouldn't let him. Vitellius's German legions had declined from the glory days of Germanicus and fought a major battle in 40 years, except the one dispatching Otho. Vitellius was captured, brought to Rome, and executed by the Senate just 8 months after they'd confirmed him as their emperor. Jerusalem was in the process of imploding, even before Titus set out. Vespasian had gone through Galilee like wildfire. Any city that attempted a defense, and they almost all did, was burned and the population slaughtered, and those left lucky enough to be alive wandering the open roads in search of any shelter. The newly homeless crowded into Jerusalem, which opened its doors to anyone claiming to be a Jew. One more side detour, please forgive me, is the most famous of the Josephus stories. Let's catch up with him. He'd been in Vespasian's clutches in iron fetters. This is how he got that way. He'd been evading Vespasian's forces with a small group of other military men after Vespasian's successful takeover of the town. Josephus and his companions managed to get themselves cornered in a small cave in the mountain. Vespasian's men parked themselves outside and demanded their surrender. As good military men should do, the Jews decided to die before surrender. Josephus was horrified. He harangued them with a lengthy exposition as to why it was wrong to kill yourself when an alternative was on offer. It was a threat, an insult to God. He was having little success, but suddenly came up with a suggestion. They would all stand in a circle. The first man would kill the 10th, take his place. The 11th would proceed around with the decimation and rinse and replace until one man was left. He would kill himself, and thus only one man would win. And one man would sin. They agreed. Somehow, Josephus was the last man standing. Some say he used his excellent computational skills to figure that out. But even without the handicap of Roman numerals, I haven't come up with a formula, and I've wasted a lot of time trying. Josephus forgot to kill himself and surrendered to Vespasian, who clapped him in irons. Titus knew a useful man and a great storyteller when he saw one, and had his father set him free, his chains broken, not merely struck off, in sign of a free pardon. He sent Josephus to Jerusalem to counsel the people to submit when he arrived, which would preserve their lives and save him the trouble of destroying the city and killing everyone inside. Among the refugees from Vespasian's early activities were groups of zealots, an abandoned group led by John of Gischala, Josephus's old nemesis from Galilee. Titus and John had met once before. With Titus at the gates of Gischala, John had escaped by pulling the wool over Titus's eyes, promising surrender, but begging for a respite because of the Sabbath, which Titus thoughtfully granted, even moving his troops away so as not to disturb the holy peace. John, of course, escaped and brought with him some thousands of townspeople, and in his rush to personal safety, abandoned them on the roads where they were helpless. The Romans caught 6,000 men and killed them. 2,500 women and children were enslaved. The refugees from Galilee who survived to reach Jerusalem had first-hand knowledge of Roman strength and brutality. They were not eager to fight to the last Jew. The zealots preached resistance, and the Sicarii were perfectly happy to murder the leading peacemakers. As for John, poor refugee, he wormed his way into the good graces of the priests, and soon his bandits took over the temple, paying no attention to the law, but eating and getting drunk within the sanctuary. John fooled the priest into thinking he supported them. They too, after all, wanted peace, but he was in contact with the Edomites, and by portraying the peace.
Jane, sorry, that's me, Zach. I don't know what it is. The screen says, oops, you blinked. What does that mean?
Oh, you missed the three emperors.
Oh, okay. No, on the screen, it says, oops, you blinked.
That's right. I had shown them, but you missed it.
I see what you're saying. Okay, got it. Sorry. So, you want to have maybe hour for some questions. Anybody has any questions, maybe, or do you want to do something like that? Just to my respects. So, you've mentioned zealots, and so do you, in your own mind, blame for destruction of the Jerusalem particularly rests in the zealous hands, and they would have never rebelled, they would have never had. How would you describe that?
Well, you can look at it two ways. Number one, Roman domination was not good for Judea. They should have been independent in a better world. But on the other hand, reality was reality. There was no way they were going to win this thing. So I'm getting most of my so-called facts from Josephus. And of course, he had his axes to grind because he was now a supporter of the Romans, though he hadn't been before. My whole opinion on this is I don't know where I would have been at the time. I am personally a very naive person, and I probably would have been up there at the barricades and everything, but I'll leave it open to everyone else as to where they would go.
I see what you're saying. I understand. Yeah, I mean, in history, obviously, and in Judaism, a lot of the facts that zealots had rebelled, a lot of the clans, a lot of the most important families, and obviously, most importantly, the temple had been destroyed, and therefore, you also had shown Josephus Flavius, who wrote about it, but according to the Jewish scholars, he was considered to be a traitor, in that regard as well. He lived in Rome. He didn't have, even though he was originally a Jewish general, so to speak, and wrote about, I don't know if you ever anybody read Jewish Wars and another writing that he wrote that didn't, that survived to this date, but the writing that he wrote against, which is against Appian, explaining Jewish traditions and kashrut laws, didn't the writing he wrote against didn't survive, but he survived, where he educated people on Jewish laws. But to Jews, he was considered to be a traitor.
Well, there is another side to this. Remember, the priests of the temple were for peace. And one of the tenets of Jewish law is that you can do almost anything to save a life, including your own. Hello?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay, I understand, but still, I mean, being a Jewish general, he gave himself up and then became a translator for Vespasian and later on Titus, and lived in Rome so successfully.
Yes.
Yeah.
What would you have done?
I don't know. I mean, everybody else conveniently killed themselves in the Jabata, where he had lost stand as a Jewish general, and he gave himself up. So he's just conveniently in the chronology of Jewish history, he's considered. He was translating. He was basically a translator to Romans cross and kill everybody in Jerusalem. So to us, it's a sacred thing, right? So it's, I don't know. I wouldn't judge him obviously as harsh, but I don't know in his shoes what I would have done. Save my skin or try to or try to kill myself. I don't know what it is. What would it be?
Anybody from the group have any input? Okay, well, in that case, I can go on. The zealots preached resistance, and the Sicarii were perfectly happy to murder the leading peacemakers. Oh, I've been there. Okay. When the Edomites arrived, John and his bandits slaughtered the priests of the temple and threw their bodies over the wall. The Edomites took that as a signal and began to pillage and murder everyone in the town who looked like someone who might favor peace, which they didn't bother to check. They posted sentries at the gates to prevent the citizens from leaving unless they paid heavily for the privilege. Those who didn't pay were presumed to be supporters of the Romans and killed. Vespasian, comfortably ensconced in Alexandria, was perfectly aware of this, and even though his generals were begging to be unleashed for a cheap victory, he ordered them to let the Jews do what they were doing. They were busy doing his work for him, he said. Vespasian had a nasty sense of humor. Eventually, the Zealots realized how their dream of liberty had been perverted by the bandits and let the Edomites know how they'd been used. The Edomites released 6,000 of their prisoners and let them leave with their wives and children to join Simon ben Eleazar at a fort on a nearby mountain called Masada. It was at this point that Vespasian learned that Vitellius had been defeated. Leaving Titus in charge of mopping up Jerusalem, he made swift tracks for Rome. We all know what happened in Judea then, and this is from the Arch of Titus, where they're taking away the spoils from the temple. If you want the ugly details, they are in Josephus' books. They are on a similar but grander scale than the ones I've described already. Titus' name is anathema among my people. I had to restrain a friend from peeing on Titus' arch in Rome. And let's see, I think we get another slide of that. Okay. And this is another celebration of Titus's triumph over Judea. After the slaughter, there was only Masada to be taken care of. The Zealots had built a wall surrounding the fort, which was 450 feet above the road below. The Romans built a platform 300 feet high and topped it with a pier 75 feet on a side to stabilize the siege engines. During that time, the Zealots built a second interior wall, but the Romans erected a 90-foot tower covered in metal plates for destroying the spear throwers and archers. The Zealots' interior wall double was made of wood and was supported by beams packed with earth as to absorb the shocks of battering rams. It was a brilliant piece of engineering, but the Romans set it aflame. The Zealots cheered as the wind blew the flames back towards the Romans. But when the wind turned, Masada began to burn. Eleazar gave a long speech, which Josephus reports, saying he heard it from an old woman who escaped the siege. Everyone else who heard that speech was dead. Preferring death to slavery, they'd killed themselves. The rebellion of the Jews was over. It had been a noble endeavor, but ultimately a futile one. Titus embarked on a victory lap around the entire eastern provinces with Queen Berenice at his side. It wasn't officially a triumph because those could only be awarded by the Senate. However, it was probably a good policy, a warning to those who would revolt against Rome, and by inclusion of Berenice, a demonstration of support from the supposedly independent rulers of the provinces, or maybe he just wanted her around. Berenice joined Titus in Rome, Vespasian still emperor. Sources differ on the date, and lived with him there for a period of years, but the pair faced a number of challenges. The worst of these was based on the Romans' memories of Mark Antony's attachment to Cleopatra. It was well known that the tribute Egypt paid to Rome had ended back with her, and she'd manipulated him in many other ways. An exotic Eastern queen was the last thing they wanted, although there was no evidence that Berenice would do the same. Titus' acceptance of a diadem on his victory tour reminded them that Julius Caesar had turned one down because it implied kingship, and there was some sentiment that his brother Domitian, who lived a more settled life than Titus had, would be a better emperor. Even though Titus, like Henry IV in Shakespeare's plays, gave up his playboy ways and settled down, eventually Vespasian ordered him to send Berenice back home. Vespasian died in 79, and Berenice returned immediately. Whether at Titus' request or otherwise isn't clear, But what is clear is that she left soon afterwards. The usual reason you will read is that he wanted to be emperor more than he wanted any woman. But she was 53 that year and he was 42. Botox hadn't been invented yet. And that is my talk. Hello?
Hi, what happened?
That's the end of my talk.
Oh, I'm sorry. So Beverly has a question.
Sure.
How did it know that Jews on Masada killed themselves?
Uh,
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can answer that, but maybe somebody else has.
Uh, so anybody can talk in regarding historically? How do we know? No, I guess not.
Well, they're
Let,
all mute anyway, but I will say that
let me unmute everybody. Maybe somebody can answer. Only thing I remember it is obviously in our history that in presumably obviously religiously we're not allowed to take our own lives
yes,
as a Jewish person. We're buried separately from the people that died natural causes or through the war. So for somebody to take their own life, it had to be extremely, it has to be some kind of, cause, I guess. And I guess in Jewish, chronology, it's looked at, obviously as being a suicide, which is a no-no. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't think that if they had a choice, if they, they would have been giving themselves to Romans, they would have gone straight to slavery. That's what happened after Jerusalem was taken over, right? The
yes,
Colosseum was built through Jewish slaves, and they have a huge menorah on the inscriptions of Colosseum, which is used through the which was built through the funds that were used to sell whatever was in the second temple rebuilt by Herod the Great. So I don't know if anybody had anything to input.
Yeah, according to Josephus, they actually there was just three people designated to kill everyone, and then one of those three killed the other two, and then killed himself. So they avoided suicide. Only one person took that sin upon himself. So that's according to Josephus. That's how they supposedly died. But as far as the proof, I mean, there is no proof. Nowadays, just the stories, but certainly no witnesses.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to obviously to come up with such, right? Obviously, everybody that kills themselves, even that lost person you said, it's like, where's the proof? Where's Genghis Khan
Yeah.
is?
Yeah, but the idea was that only one person committed suicide because of the sin. Uh, but I was also wondering what is it about Berenice? Because we know that Cleopatra was certainly a great woman in many ways. The way she handled over a pretty long period of time, both Julius Caesar and Antony. But what about Berenice? That she managed to entice Titus, and not only just for a brief period, but for quite a long period of time. Uh, After all, he was much younger, and he was the son of an emperor. He was a supreme commander at the time of the destruction. Um, and you know, is there anything? By the way, this is masking Jane. Maybe you did research about your character, or what was that about her that she managed to achieve that?
love is very, very strange, and I have only one word, and that is Kamala.
Pamela? What do you mean?
I guess she's queen now.
Or Camilla.
Camilla. Oh, okay. I never heard it in conversation. King Charles's wife.
Oh, I see.
King Charles III.
Right. Yeah, that's yes. Okay. Yeah, it's a similar story. Yeah. But we don't know much about her. It appears about her character, about her actions. We like, for instance, we know a lot about Cleopatra. A lot more about some of her character, some of the things she made, some interesting moves, like she helped Anthony, with supplies after his kind of fiasco with Parthians. So she did a number of things we learned who she was, kind of. But what about Berenice? What do we know about what kind of person she was?
Well, I think we can infer that she was a very courageous person. I think we can infer that she was also very beautiful and that she used biology to get to where she wanted to be. And and also that she could be a team player. She could reign alongside her brother. What she did, her life is a very eventful one. And the character that you have to participate successfully in those adventures and events that she had.
Yeah. By the way, I read many years ago, and maybe if anyone interested, there is, it's not a very famous writer in the United States, but it's a German writer, Leon Feuchtwanger, who wrote a trilogy about, it's called Joseph's trilogy, or maybe Judean War trilogy.
Greg,
And
it's
yes.
very distorted. You talk, it's like you're really far. Can you bring
Oh,
the mic?
really? Can you,
Yeah.
how about now? Is now better?
Yeah, better. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So Leon Feuchtwanger, and he wrote this trilogy, and there he gives the interpretation of the character. I mean, like, obviously, from whatever meager information, he kind of built his interpretation of the character. So it's kind of interesting if anybody wants to try that.
Yes, it does sound really interesting. All of this, every single work of art that is built on Berenice comes from the same skinny passages in the books I talk about. There really isn't anything else.
Yeah. So anybody have any questions?
Why was she called a queen of cultists? Isn't cultists was one of the ancient?
Cilicia. I mean, there is a city in Syria. I don't know, but she was also called. It's just Cilicia or Kilikia. They call it, like Jane mentioned. She showed it. It's in southern Turkey on the Mediterranean coast, on the southern.
Right.
Because this is famous place. You remember, first of all, Pompey was famous for getting rid of Cilician pirates in his own. That was one of his achievements. But we're talking, over 100 years before. So Cilicia was famous, and then also it's also a place later on that was place for Armenian kingdom. And of course, that Saint Paul was from Cilicia, from the
Yes.
Tarsus.
Yes.
So that's what we know Cilicia for. Yeah, it's just part of the division that happened in Herodian dynasty.
Yeah. I'm sure that Pompey got rid of the Cilician pirates and probably took the place over at that point. And that's just my guess. And so it was obviously part of the Roman Empire at that point.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah,
Right,
thank
that's why St. Paul was a Roman citizen.
Right. And she married the king of Chalcis. The
Right.
Herod that she married was king of Chalcis. And then when he died, she came back to Jerusalem and reigned alongside her brother, also named Herod, like everybody else was.
Right.
And was there a relationship with her brother? Well, you don't know, the rumors.
I really honestly don't know. I think it was nasty gossip for the most part, because she did marry somebody else in the interim. Then she came back to the brother. Who knows? And in the end, who cares? The fact that she didn't get pregnant or we don't know about this argues against it, I would think. Herod of Chalcis was her uncle. She married him against Jewish law, and then he died. She came back, and then she married again.
So in one of the sources where they say during the Judean war, they I read that they say that about 1 million people were killed. Have you read anything like that?
Yeah.
That it seems like it's enormous considering the population in those days were not like nowadays. I don't know what the total population of Judea was. I mean, this whole region, Livan, I think, it's hard to imagine it was more than a few millions, maybe five, I don't know, but like 1 million, that seems like a huge loss. I'm talking about this is just the Judea.
Well, I had read that 23,000 Jews were crucified on the road to Judea at one point. And this extermination of entire populations that was going on. And cities, I mean, people have big apartments in New York, but probably 99% of people in ancient cities lived very close together.
But though the Jews were taken out of Jerusalem, but there are still Jews left in the area, right? Because we know that the next uprising really, the Bar Kokhba, which just happened like, I don't know, 80 years later, that was the final one. That's when almost all Jews were exterminated. So there were some Jews left in Judea, even after this Judean war and destruction of the temple, right?
Well, you can't really do a march and exterminate every town and every village on the way. He just looked at the bigger ones that were on his path and he exterminated all of those. And then, of course, there were many refugees and many of them didn't get caught and people came back and so forth. So there were Jews around. I mean, 1 million people is a heck of a lot of people, but the population of almost all ancient regions has recently been rising. I don't know why that is true, but archaeologically they find evidence of more, I guess, more bones, more, who knows?
And the other interesting statistic, they almost got 100,000 slaves that were brought into Roman Empire, and famously, those some of those slaves were the ones who built the Colosseum, the Colosseum of Rome that we know right now. This is also.
Yeah, I think Domitian had made the Colosseum in memory of his brother.
Sorry to Greg. I just wanted to see if there's anybody else had any questions, but I appreciate getting the conversation going. What made Jews and other nationalities, so to speak, we can say, use Hellenistic culture and assimilate so quickly within literally one generation? What was the economic reason? What was the reason that they totally abandoned their culture and assimilated so quickly? And then there was obviously zealots and the people that would follow the modern, religion, and obviously being Jewish, it's interesting aspect what happened in modern times, right? World War II, before World War II, a lot of the German Jews did not even, some intermarry, some did not even identify as Jews. They were basically German, so to speak. So just want to know, why does history keep repeating itself? And then we're always almost reminded, to go back to where, what we are. So what, in those times, why did they become so Hellenized so quickly? And then what was the reason? Economic reason, political reason? Jane.
What was the reason? I suppose because they were a literate group of people, down to practically everybody male. And so it was easy for them to do it. And also they had been in contact with Greek civilization through the Seleucids.
I see what you're saying. Because we do see that Beverly wants to say something. Beverly, go ahead.
Can I just speak?
Yes,
Can you hear me? You can
Go
hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
So I do know that when Jews were forced to leave Jerusalem, I think there were 100,000, and many of them were engaged building the Colosseum. They never really made their way into Roman society, and in fact, remained as a group. And I don't know when, but at one point in history, I'm assuming it's after Catholicism was made the main religion, that Jews were forced into living in ghettos, which of course became the way of life for Jews in many places in Europe thereafter. But initially, they were forced to leave their homeland and then remain together and practice Judaism as they knew it. And they were not persecuted in any way until, as I said earlier, Catholicism became the main religion.
I think that it's the religion that kept Jews help them to retain their identity. But I think when you were speaking about the German Jews, so starting from the 19th century, there were less and less people who stayed religious in Europe, especially in Northern Europe. And certainly the same thing goes with Jews, as they got an opportunity to get an education. And a lot of them lost their religion, and that was the reason how they got assimilated. That's similar
Greg,
in Russia. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was just going to add on to what Greg said. The Jews who saw themselves as Germans before Jews tended to be, as Greg said, far more educated and far more accomplished in the fields of medicine, in the fields of music, and so forth, where the poor Jews were living in what were called the shtetls. And they, poverty was really their way of life. but their life centered around their synagogue. And if you look at the Jews of Sepharad, Spain and Portugal, those who did not convert were adept at hiding their Jewishness. And it was really through the women. The women were the ones who remembered the prayers and carried them through lighting candles on Shabbat and singing songs and telling stories. And until eventually, by decree, they were either forced to convert, they had to leave, or they were oftentimes burned. So you're right that religion played a significant role in the preservation of the Jews.
Yeah,
and I think also those highly educated German Jews who saw themselves first as Germans, their privilege in some ways enabled them to not look at religion as something united. And as we know, when Jews were counted, they included those wealthy, accomplished Jews as well as the ones in the shtetl. And I think that became most shocking to that population.
Yeah, as far as like the departed Jews, when the expulsion happened in 1492, the majority of them converted. Whether true or not, that's the question. But we're only talking about just maybe 200,000 Jews who were expelled, but there were many more there. Like maybe like 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the Jews, they have stayed and converted, but then it was very hard for them to retain their religion because the Inquisition was especially targeting those who didn't convert, for real. So, I mean, eventually, after a few generations, it disappeared.
Sorry.
Yeah, I would just wanted to say that the DNA test actually was surprising that in Spanish people, they said that there are about 20% of their DNA is Jewish.
Yes, absolutely. And I think probably, I don't really know how many years, but certainly not that many, as more and more these conversos, well, their family have come to know that they are in fact at least partly Jewish. Also, when the Sephardic Jews were told to leave before the law to exterminate them, they made their way throughout South America, onto Turkey, even into Asia, that many of the Jews in the far reaches of the world originally had their roots in Spain and Portugal. Well, there's an exhibit at the Jewish Museum. I think it's at the Jewish Museum. The Sassoons. Richard spoke a little bit that was part of his family. they were, they were not Sephardic. They were, they were not from Spain or Portugal.
Yeah, they're Mizrahi.
But Mizrahi actually. So that's totally a different topic.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
mean, when
Mizrahi, they're probably
right,
the descendants of those Jews who did not
right,
return from
from
Babylon.
Iran,
Yeah,
right, from
Babylon.
Persia,
From Babylon. It was after
right, and
Babylon
then
captivity
right,
when the Persians allowed them to return. Oh, again, most of them stayed. You know, it's only a small portion of them returned to Judea and reestablished Judaism there, the correct one. But the majority of them stayed, and you know, they're Mizrahi. Well, anyway, so I think
I don't know if you guys know this, but so apparently the European Union back in 2016 had enacted the law that if you can trace your roots to
right,
Spain, you have a right to get a at least Schengen visa and European Union citizenship because your ancestry had, moved out, so to speak. So a lot of the Jews are from my region, even though we've been converted to Sephardic, stream of Judaism. We were all Mizrahi because originally we all moved to Babylon. Like my family, in 15th century was never in Spain, but one of the Moroccan Jews who were a Spanish Jew moved to our region in Uzbekistan and converted all the Bukharian Jews. At that time they weren't called Bukharian, let's just call them indigenous Jews, into the Sephardic, much stronger wave stream to Judaism. But still people from my region were able to somehow claim the Schengen, the
really?
visa, because of the fact. And in fact, in Spain,
How do you do that?
I don't know. In Toledo, well, you always have to say that you're a Sephardic Jew, and they didn't really. I mean, it happened in 1456. It was a long time ago.
92,
so
1492.
1492, right? So it's a long time ago, right? So in any case, there is a museum in Spain. I think it's either Toledo, where they call it a museum of keys. So all the Jews basically left the keys of the houses in 1492, to preserve that own properties in the area. So it's like 3 walls of just covered with keys of the former Jews that left Sepharad to go to Turkey, Vatican or whatever other countries that accepted them at the time. So, which is an interesting aspect of this.
Yeah. The main migration of those Sephardic Jews of expulsion was to North Africa, and then to the east, to the North Africa, to the Turkey and the east, and of course some of them went to Europe as well. All right, I guess if anyone has any more questions, so just close.
If not, Jane, thank you so much. We'll have to think about. Let me know who the next victim is.
If nobody's claimed Cleopatra, yes, I will.
Let's do Cleopatra because there's so many aspects to this lady. I mean,
and so much controversy.
So much controversy, so much, the fact that she had a baby with a Caesar, that's controversy enough. So it definitely is an interesting.
And Anthony also 3 children.
And 3 children with Anthony. So I mean, obviously he's connected to Caesar, right? So that was an interesting aspect. Thank you so much, Jane. I wish you guys enjoy this nice weather. And then hopefully, we'll get a bigger turnout next time because probably it's just a nice weather. But sorry, but it's nothing. I mean, at one point at the height of it, we had about 20 people, so that's good. All right, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, thank you, Jane.